Herzlich willkommen zu 99 zu 1. Welcome to 99 zu 1. This is an English episode, so I won't be talking German from now on. We will continue our series on postcolonialism, ? What is postcolonialism? What are their assumptions? What are their errors? We have already produced a small introductory episode about the 10 main critiques that Michael Kuhn wants to offer. In the first episode of the series itself, we already dealt with some of the key arguments that they bring up, and we ended at the point where we wanted to talk about some of the key thinkers, the so-called masterminds of postcolonial theory, postcolonial thinking. And this is what this episode is going to be about. And for that, I have invited again Michael Kuhn. Welcome back, Michael.
Hello.
So, Michael, we will dive in quite straight away into the question of the masterminds of the postcolonial debate, let's say. But maybe before we do that, makes sense because it's been a while. Give us a short introduction. Where did we end up, and why is it important now to go a little bit through these so-called masterminds?
Yeah. Surprisingly, you didn't call me Michael. Should I call you from now on Nadim? Or...
Nadim.
Nadim. Yeah, of course. Okay, yes. So, in fact, in order to discuss how some examples of what post-colonial thinking is about, what their theories are, I want to summarize what I said in that first introductory section. And I can say in advance, the reason why I want to do that is, as I will try then immediately, right away, is to show how the reality that has been created after the Second World War, the political reality, is somehow the origin of post-colonial thinking. Let me say something else here, because many people, or not many, a few people asked me. I want to clarify this. The notion of post-colonial thinking is a kind of school of thought that has been created mainly by people from what they call today the Global South. And that is a way of thinking about the world. It is a school of thought. It's not just this one and that one, but it is a school of thought that is shared, especially by most of the critical intellectuals in the former colonized world. And what their theories this school of thought is about, I want to discuss immediately in this section today after my introduction. The introduction today is just a summary of the first video. So what was the first video about? I just made a kind of view on the historical situation, what has happened before that historical period, from which in around the 90s, this school of thought was created, emerged. And what was that historical situation? The historical situation roughly was this. The years, the time I'm talking about is the time after the Second World War ended, with the victory of the United States becoming the ruling world power. The other point I wanted to talk about, since I'm talking here about the school of thought, the way of theorizing, the way of thinking about the world, which was spread over the thinkers in the post-colonial world, is this. The colonized world was until then fighting for what they called independence. This fight for independence was a fight against the colonialism. And as a fight against the colonialism of the capitalist world, it was a fight against capitalism. The political movements, the political activists fighting against colonialism were all Marxists, educated by the school of thought of the Soviet interpretation of Marx, of the Soviet Marxism. Stop at this point. If we now look at what was the historical situation at the end of the 80s, all the colonized parts of the world had become what? They had become part of the capitalist world. Unlike what all these political activists fighting against colonialism were aiming at, fighting for another concept of running a society than running the society under the rationality of capitalism. Unlike this intention, these objectives of the fight against colonialism, all the countries, former colonized part of the world, became exactly a part of this capitalist rationalism. They all were subsumed under the rule of the rationale of increasing wealth calculated in money. In other words, the result was that it turned out to be the opposite of what all these anti-colonialist movements were aiming at. I briefly discussed how this can be explained. I mentioned the war in Vietnam, but I don't want to repeat this here because otherwise I repeat the whole introduction. I just want to say the surprising historical development was that the fight for independency was a fight against capitalism, and the result of the, in fact, reached independency was the integration of the former colonized world into the world of capitalism, worldwide ruled by the world power United States, the winner of World War II. A second thing should be mentioned in order to then arrive at the questions that I want to raise and to discuss under the notion of what this school of thought called postcolonialism is all about. A second thing must be mentioned here. The reason why this fight against colonialism was fought as a fight against capitalism, or let's say better, the basis of that was, the precondition of that was, that there was another world power with an alternative anti-capitalist society system. That was the Soviet Union. It was, in fact, the power of the Soviet Union, the power of an anti-capitalist society system, on which this fight of the anti-colonialists against capitalism was based. It was supported by the Soviet Union. Still, the situation, I don't want to discuss this now politically, the situation at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s was that the Soviet Union still existed, but the colonized part of the world fighting against capitalism became part of capitalism. It became part of the world, part of the so-called Western world ruled by the United States and by the rationale of capitalism. And this raises a couple of questions regarding this school of thought. I have to say, this raises much more questions, and it raises especially the questions, how could and how did this happen? That the whole, I don't know, kind of, a major part of the world, I don't want to talk about percentages here, which size it is and so on, doesn't matter, but a major part of the world, the former colonized part of the world, was against capitalism and was supported by the world power, the Soviet Union, in their fight against capitalism. But then what happened is they became part of the capitalist ruled world. And of course, this raises the question, how did this happen? And this is, of course, a very important question to be discussed. But I don't discuss this question here. I'm limiting my considerations about the theoretical part of this development, of this historical development. And the theoretical part means what happened and what happens in this school of thought, in this debate, in which is called postcolonialism, despite of this history. So what happened to all these anti-capitalist thought, and how have they transported their views against capitalism into this debate now called postcolonialism? So, though again, it is of course very crucial to discuss how could it happen that all the anti-capitalist movements in the colonized world became part of capitalism. How did this happen? How did it work? Of course, this is a politically very vibrant discussion, but this is not what simply not what I'm dealing with. I'm just dealing with the sort of theoretical department of this development, means raising the question, what happened, so that's the note I'm making in my paper, what happened to the anti-capitalist thoughts among all the political activists and intellectuals in the countries which have now been made a part of the world entirely consisting and ruled by capitalism. And this is the question I want to discuss when I discuss this school of thought called postcolonialism, because this school of thought of postcolonial is the answer on this question. This is the way of thinking that emerged then from the 90s on, in which all these former anti-capitalist capitalist thinkers found their new theoretical home, if you want to phrase it in that way. I added, because I think it is necessary, one point related to the political economic situation I have to mention, because without that it is, from my point of view, impossible to explain, to understand this debate. And the point I mentioned, I don't elaborate on this here, just as a reminder. Since this debate is as I will show immediately, very much focusing on questions of identity, more precisely on political identities, though this identity discussion is not politically constructed. I will explain that strange contradiction soon. This can be only understood if one pays a bit attention on the particular situation of discussing this question of identities, of political identities in this new, in these societies, all now becoming, or which have now all become part of the capitalist world. Since it is so much about identity, I made some few remarks about how identity is created in these capitalist societies. I call them citizen societies. Doesn't matter, it is the same. What I explained there was this. In the, let's call it normal capitalist, in the Western capitalist society, this concept of identity, which means the identification of the citizens with their societies, with their national societies. The identification works via what I described as a conceded materialism. That wants to say, people say, I share my national identity with my country thanks to the fact that their country provides them the condition to exist in the way the country defines the way of existence. That means, thanks to my country, I can earn my salary as a service for a capitalist, or for the capitalists. This is the basis on which people identify themselves with their nation state. Now, the particular situation of these parts of the world, the former colonized world, which has now also been subjected under the rules of capitalism, has a particularity, and this particularity is important to understand why and how this debate, coined postcolonialism or decolonization, discusses what it discusses. And this particularity is this one. In these countries, they are now also ruled by the rationale of capitalism, which means for people, you have to care about your existence. And you can only care about your existence via getting an income through a salary, through labor that you provide to a so-called employer, to a capitalist. And this is the kind of mechanism, as the ideological mechanism on which, as I explained before, the identification of these people with their society and their political system and their political power works. Now, this identification doesn't work in these countries simply because these countries have the particularity that they are part of the rationale of capitalism, but they don't have the economic structure to really provide their inhabitants, the citizens of these countries, the only way they allow them to get an income, a salary via working for capitalists, because that economy doesn't provide that kind of labor market. It doesn't exist in these countries. Now, again, here an interesting discussion could start about then how do these countries, how do they work? How does it work if there is no labor market via which the citizens can gain their income, though this is the only way to get an income in these countries as well? How does it work? That is a important debate, but again, I don't want to discuss this here because I am focusing on this video about the theoretical implications this kind of economic political situation has. But it has to be said because otherwise you cannot understand this debate. So again, how do people create their identity under the condition that this basis of identity formation you find in the so-called northern capitalist world via the labor market providing the jobs through which you can get your income and make sure that you can survive, that you can exist, that this rule also exists in these countries, but it doesn't provide the condition for this. Only that far. So from these points on, from these 2 points on, from what I said before, to summarize it again, from the phenomenon that the social thought in this former colonized world was a thought ruled by anti-capitalist ideas, transformed towards societies which joined capitalism. Then, secondly, joining capitalism, introducing the rationality of capitalism in these parts of the world, but doing that in a way that it doesn't provide the existential living conditions for surviving in capitalism. Based on these two characteristics, describing the main development of history after the Second World War from the point of view of these parts of the world, the former colonized parts of the world, based on this, I want to discuss the way the social thought in this part of the world was then constructed. The social thought coining themselves post-colonial thinking, decolonized thinking, or in similar ways. So what I'm talking about now is the creation and the nature of a school of thought that was responding to these two challenges. A way of thinking that was all over influenced by anti-capitalism, by the critique of capitalism, adjusted to the rationality, practically adjusted to the rationality of capitalism. And a second challenge to create an identification with this part of the world, with this part of the world, living in this part of the world, not being able to count on the identification of the citizens thanks to the what I call the conceded materialism, because there is not such a thing in these countries. So based on this, let's go to what I call the masterminds of post-colonial thinking. Again, I want to stress, because some people said, can you not discuss for example, Spivak or any of these theoreticians with their theories? Yes, of course, I should, but this is not the intention of my video here. I just want to give some characteristics of this school of thought in general, therefore discuss also some examples. But of course, it would be very good if somebody takes this as an invitation and then says, okay, I understand what you say about this school of thought. I will discuss Homi Bhabha or Chakrabarti or how they ever called. I come to that again. I will only touch on them in order to give a general view how this school of thought is thinking. I do that soon, but before that, let me start with this section now by a short introduction into this section. My short introduction raises the question, the following question. It is obvious from the topics all these post-colonial thinkers like Spivak and Bhabha and how they're all called, from the topics they are discussing, they're all talking about the challenges to create identities. They're all about identities. I avoid the word political identities because, in fact, a political identity is very much or very close to what you could also call a national identity. But they don't discuss national identities. They don't discuss how to identify, how to become a Kenyan or how to become whatever kind of country you could mention, a Cameroonian or whatever. They don't discuss this. They discuss identity, the question of identity, beyond the political identification with the specific national power of the nation state. And instead, what they are discussing in this school of thought called postcolonialism are much broader questions. They discuss identities based on definitions of concepts of what social communities are, how to identify yourself with a society, not a particular society of a particular state, but of society, of any communities. For this very reason, if you go into this literature, if you read this literature produced in this debate, you find, for example, books, publications, papers, whatever, which start with debates. You wonder how could this arrive at or deal with at all the question of creating identities with any communities. They start with discussing issues of aesthetics. I can recommend a book, I think I also mentioned in my German video, I hope so, written by a colleague called Leon Marie Niodo. And he discussed a book which is called, titled, I think, I forgot the price, I don't have it in my mind. It's something like a post-colonial discourse or anything like that. And I just want to say, the remarkable thing about this book, and not only about this book, but if you go through all these famous colleagues from Africa, you will see that many of them start their debates from discussing the concept of aesthetics, and not at all from any characteristics of their country, their nation state. They start from aesthetics. And this is remarkable because it says that these countries, these theoreticians, they are struggling with what I tried to say before. There is no basis for identifying yourself with a community, with a national community, because of this not existing conceded materialism. For this reason, the creation of an identity of, let's say, a feeling of being part of a community, the sense for being part of any community in these societies must be created, but can only be created beyond the material interests of the people. And this is something one should notice. That is important. The whole debate, I can say that already at this stage, just showing at the topics they discuss. And the topic they discussed is all kind of variations of identifying yourself with the societies. Who am I in the world is the question they raise. Where am I? Where's my location? What do I have to do with these societies? From the very beginning, they eliminate from their discussion any reflections on the material living interests of the people. And this is a very affirmative response to the situation they're confronted with. The situation is this. As I said, the rationality of capitalism has been introduced in these societies, but without the existential living conditions for the citizens. And discussing the identification of these citizens with these societies beyond the material living interests of the people is the appropriate affirmative response to the fact that these societies are not able to provide any kind of identification with these societies via the material living conditions. That is already something one should mention about this debate, already at this stage. Now, one can already see from this, from the topics they are discussing, before discussing how they discuss these topics, that all these debates have an overarching, newly created concept based on which all these debates are carried out. And this overarching concept is called culture. Culture is the concept, that is my hypothesis, that has been created towards the end of the last century by anthropology serving the reflections of the former colonized world and their intellectuals to find ways for the identification of their people with the world they have been confronted with. What is culture? What is that concept of culture? As most of you might know, originally, when you were talking about culture, you were talking about the products of human minds, in other words, called products you characterize as arts. Culture was, until then, painting, music, poetry, and similar things. It is not a coincidence that this concept of culture a category which characterizes products of human mind called art became the overarching concept of thinking about the world from that time on. What do I want to say with these strange things? Why has, and what does it mean if this concept of culture has now been transported into the reflections about how we live? What is the nature of our life? What does it mean if this concept of culture originally applied to the creation of arts? What does it mean if that has been created as a way to reflect about the world, the social world as a whole? It has been created by anthropology, and it is this shift without which, this shift in anthropological thinking, without which I think it is impossible to really understand what the meaning of the school of thought called decolonialism is, because as you can see when you look at any kind of decolonial thinking, it is always arguing with culture. Just to take quickly, you know, Homi Baba is talking about culture, Spivak is calling about culture, and all of them are talking about culture. I will come to this point, how they talk about culture then. But I have to say a few words about culture at this point. So it is a creature of anthropology. If I'm correct, I think it was Clifford Geertz who suggested this category to think about the world, the social world, through the concept of culture. And what does this mean? A short reminder: anthropology was the disciplinary social science in the concept of the whole disciplinary social sciences, which had the mission to think about the world. Next to sociology, political science, economy, and so on, they were all theories which were thinking about the national societies, economy, the political system, etc., always nationally constructed. Anthropology was the only science at that time that was focusing, looking at the world. And the way it looked at the world was to distinguish the world in civilized and uncivilized societies. If somebody ever read a book from an anthropologist, you would find that the anthropologists were these guys who were traveling into the, let's call it a bit sort of in a bit kind of funny way. Right? They were going into the remote jungles, the more remote the better, and wrote their books about what they found in these remote places in the world, about the way of living of these people there. And well, these books are quite funny, but basically they are quite boring, because whatever they observe in anything, these people who were living there, they found that everything they did was indicating to them that they were on the way towards the society systems of the civilized world. And the civilized world, needless to say, of course, was the world ruled by the rationality of capitalism. That was civilization. And everything that was not ruled by capitalism was uncivilized. But everything they observed there was to find out that they were steps on their way, making steps towards civilization. Anthropology had a really dramatic crisis thanks to the transformation of the colonized world into the society concept of the colonizers, into capitalism. The distinction, thanks to which they could constitute their theory saying we are the ones who look at the non-civilized world, was gone. It didn't exist anymore. The whole world overnight was suddenly civilized. They were all following the rationality of what they call as what anthropologists call as the way of living of civilization. So what anthropology did at that point was to create a new way to distinguish societies. And the way they distinguished societies was the concept of culture. And now, at this point, it is possible to understand what it means that a concept, culture, that was originally created for the creation of arts, that this concept was now applied to distinguish how people were living differently in different parts of the world. Culture, this anthropological concept of culture, no longer talking about music, poets, or whatever, was now talking about exactly the different arts of living. The distinction between the colonized part of the world and the civilized world was replaced by a concept of theorizing that distinguished different arts of living. And in this concept, the rationality of capitalism was, as a consequence of its entire spread all over the world, naturalized towards the natural living conditions of humans, as it has already been done with this notion of civilization. So if capitalism is civilization, and then the former non-civilized people were also subsumed under the rationality of capitalism, they were all civilized, and the distinction between all the civilized societies was now considered as the way societies, if you want, manage, cope with the rationality of capitalism. Anthropology calls civilization. This is the creature of anthropological thinking, the concept of culture, which from that time on became a cross-cutting way of reflecting across all the disciplines. From that time on, sociology, political science, economy, they all introduced the concept of culture as a category distinguishing the interpretations of the topics they were dealing with. In political science, the culture of politics; in economy, the culture of economics, and so on and so on. And this is also the category through which all the former Soviet Marxist thinkers started by then to think about the world, especially the former colonized part of the world. I want to discuss this now here in the next step, making a little distinction. The distinction also these post-colonial thinkers make. The distinction is thinking about these societies, inside these societies, and thinking about cultures, about the world outside. That means the relation between these societies. So let me give some examples how the concept of culture, this way of thinking, naturalizing the living conditions of capitalism, and looking at the world through the concept of culture, that means as a kind of art of living inside these societies. There are variations of this concept of culture, and they are concepts like race, ethnicity, and such kind of things, which are all entities which have in common that, as I said before, culture, racism, right, ethnicities, etc., etc., they all have one thing in common, as I said before. They talk about what these societies share, what they have in common, beyond the material living conditions of these societies. And the reason why they discuss that beyond the living condition is what I discussed before, because these living conditions do not exist. So the challenge these reflections have is how to create a kind of identity with the community you live in beyond the material living conditions, because the material living conditions are simply a disaster. So they don't provide any means of identifying yourself with these societies capitalism has imposed on them. Some example of decolonized thinking, as I mentioned before already. This book from Leon Marignodo, and look at all these publications. I cannot mention all the list here. Just go through them, look at them, see if I'm correct or not. If I'm not correct, let me know. They all deal with the concept of aesthetics. Aesthetics is a major path towards discussing who is an African. And it is this question which are exactly discussed in this, the identification of African people with Africa, being an African. It is remarkable at this point, if you didn't notice that, in fact, they do not discuss the identification with a nation or a nation state. It is, in fact, the question who is an African. And in this debate, they talk about, beyond all the real living conditions they are confronted with, they practice, and they have to cope with, the rationality of capitalism, they shift the question away from these debates towards questions about such points which, what is considered as humanity? This kind of concept created and introduced by anthropological thinking. So it is reflections about living in this world entirely beyond the real living conditions of this world. It is a deflection that is carried out in the world of aesthetics, in the world of philosophies, in the world of culture, in the world of religion, in all parts of a mind which creates its view on the world beyond the real world. To give you another example, there is a Japanese guy called Sato, just an example. And he talks about thick and thin thoughts. And he talks about thick and thin thoughts because he is trying to handle the problem that if thoughts are too thick, that means if they are too close to the reality, they are not able to create any kind of identification with the reality, because, to say it in a bit kind of rough way, the reality is just too bad. I was about to say the reality is a shit. In order to motivate anybody via the reality to identify yourself with the reality. So this is a kind of very funny, crazy discussion, but that's the discussion he does. The difference between, that's not created by him, this distinction of thin and thick categories. I don't remember at the moment who created, that was an American guy, but he applies this distinction in order to find out how thought must be constructed in order to be able to identify yourself with the reality, starting from the point of departure that the reality should not be too much play a role in these reflections because it doesn't provide the conditions to identify yourself with that. Another example, there is just any example. There is a sociologist, an Arab sociologist. He's called Faleh is his name, and he makes a suggestion why the concept constituting sociological thinking is not appropriate for the thinkers in the Arab world. And the concept he is somehow rejecting is the very famous constitutional concept for sociology, in the West at least, he says, as he argues, and that is the concept of citizen and society. And he says, his argument is, the concept of citizen society, which plays indeed with a naturalized contradiction between citizens and societies. So it plays with the contradiction capitalism really implies, that the society is creating all kinds of rules which are not serving the interests of the citizens. So the sociology is discussing the question, how can a society create communalities within this contradiction between the citizen of the society, of course, making the contradiction between societies and citizens emerging from the rationality of capitalism, naturalizing this, and then the mission of sociology is how do we bring both together? And what then is always called the togetherness, the communality of people in this society is what keeps sociologists busy. So this guy is then saying, you cannot apply this concept of citizens and society, or citizens versus societies, in our societies here. And why not? Because nobody would really share this idea that you have to join the rules of the society in order to be a member of the society, because sharing these rules is somehow impossible for the citizens of these societies. And that's why he said, let's call it process and conflict. So he wants to make that conflict that is implicit only in the concept of sociology and, of citizen and society, what is only implicit there, and what they somehow smoothly, sociologists, wipe away, he says, let's make that explicit. Because this suits into the culture of our society, which has too many conflicts between the society and the citizens in order to be able to wipe that away and just to integrate, to somehow create the idea, the fantasy that both should be easily integrated, as Western sociology, as he says, does it. So these are two examples of how the so-called indigenization of thinking works by adjusting thinking to the challenges of the discussion of creating communal identities in a society in which this kind of automatism of a conceded materialism, where people identify them with their societies via the existence of at least existential living conditions, in which this doesn't exist. Now maybe I should say that at this point here, if it was not obvious, just to say this, these examples show that, of course, as I already discussed when I was talking about the critique of Eurocentrism, this doesn't critique anything about any disciplinary way of this disciplinary construction of thinking. It doesn't discuss anything what constitutes sociology in these incriminated Western social sciences. What it does, it creates variations of that, and via creating variations of that, what does this post-colonial thinking do? It applies and shares these Western social thought. They reject. It applies this way of thinking to these parts of the former colonized world exactly in this way, by creating variations of these theories adjusted to the particular living conditions, the not existing conceded materialism in these societies. This is the way how this school of thought called postcolonialism constructs its thoughts for the identity formation, for the identity creation within these societies. Maybe I should add this at this point, just comes to my mind. Since there is no way of creating the identity with the rationality, with the societies ruled by the rationality of capitalism in these societies via that conceded materialism, there is also no way to create an identity with the nationalities. So, as I said before, calling it political identity is a little bit misleading, because these identity discussions, in fact, are not politically constructed identities. That's why people these whole debates, as I tried to show along this discussion of Leon Marignodo, but take anybody you want, they are therefore talking not about. I think I mentioned that before. They are therefore not talking about any identity related to a particular nation state, but they therefore talk about African identity. And broader than that, as you know, this debate, this school of thought called postcolonialism or decolonization of thinking, that creates identities. That brings me to the next point. They call it Southern theories. And this is remarkable. They create identities, let me put it that way, not in a very modest way. Who talks about the global South creates a view on the world in which they shift, they move, they try to persuade the people living under the rationality of capitalism in this global South towards an identity and towards a conflict, not against the rationality of capitalism, what it means for the living conditions of the people. They shifted towards a competition between the global South and the North. And of course, in the world of thinking, it is a competition between the thought from the global South and the thought from the global North. But of course, this implies an image about the world in which they define that the concern people should be bothered with, the way they should see the world, is to interpret what they do, their lives, as an exercise that consists of a competition between two global parts of the world, the global North against the global South, and vice versa. This is what post-colonial thinking is a concept what post-colonial thinking creates. It wants to persuade an identity of people with the living conditions of the rationality of capitalism as a way to practice this concept by creating a competition between two parts of the world, which is, by the way, very nice for their political powers, because they can also always say, you know, what we are doing here, all the shit comes from the global north, and the global south countries, their nation states, their political powers do nothing else but to protect you against the global north, while they are preparing their societies and their countries for the very rationality of capitalism, from which, in fact, the global north political powers are much more benefiting than the countries do. But that is how these countries are made to serve, by the political powers in these countries are made to serve the imperialist part of the world. And presenting this by the social science thinkers as a competition about who is representing the better part of the world. This concept of culture interpreting humanity, presenting this as the real battle between the global south and the global north is, let me phrase it that way, not so nice. So if you then look at the discourse in this school of thought called postcolonialism, if you then look at how they discuss the world as a whole, not the identity, the formation, the identity creation in these parts of the world, but if they look at the world as a whole, then you find, again, I'm not talking about the material living conditions, I'm talking about the way these this school of thought is thinking about the world. I talk about the section of the series. If you then go through this school of thought, which is dealing with this, with a view on this world, as I already said, they introduce this concept of global south and global north, and by doing that, they create an image of for people of being part of this competition. This is somehow then carried out, this view is carried out in these, just to give some examples, in this post-colonial school of thought via categories which discuss this in the world of science as, for example, a scientific hegemony. A famous author, Farid Alatas, is writing books in which he discusses the scientific hegemony. And if you read these books, what he is saying there, you can see how these thinkers deal with and how they discuss the world of science, interpreted by post-colonial thinking as a competition battle between how do you say, parts of the world constructed as these, by these thinkers, as these entities, neglecting all the kind of battles and conflicts between these countries of the global south and within these countries, between the political bodies, their capitalists, and the people who are living there. That's all wiped away by this nice notion of being part of the global south. So how this Farid Alatas then, for example, is thinking about when he talks about scientific hegemony, what he is discussing there, just to give you an example, is, well, quite rough. What he is saying there, Farid Alatas, is he's discussing in one of his books, he's discussing the situation of the social sciences in Japan. And in this discussion about the social sciences in Japan, this guy is seriously raising the question if it was possible to use the economic power Japan has, interestingly, very much in line with the ideology of Japan, which is always telling the rest of the world, we have economic power, yes, we have, but military power, we don't have that. We have nothing to do with military power. And of course, this is also a very successfully spread ideology of Japan. Japan is a military power like mad, but they always say no, it's only for defending us, so it's not a political and not a military power. This guy, of course, I don't know if one can say, is trapped by this ideology of Japan, but instead of introducing and discussing the power Japan also has as a military power in the world, he is discussing the power, the economic power Japan has, and he is discussing the economic power Japan has as an instrument in order to use this economic power for improving the scientific power of the South against the scientific power of the North. So one can see they have no problem at all with using science as an instrument for carrying out the power battles of nation states, or even more of globally constructed entities like the global South against the global North. Not at all. They quite frankly discuss could the economic power Japan has been used to increase, or a country like Japan has, I have to say more precisely, could it be used for improving the scientific power, as it's called, the global South has for this kind of competition battle in which he interprets scientific thinking has to, what he thinks scientific scientific reflections have to carry out these battles between globally constructed entities. So no scruples somehow thinking in that way. That is what post-colonial thinking is doing when they talk about the world and the role of the social sciences in this world, being a power to somehow respond to the global North by aiming at overtaking them in their power positions and shifting the power positions from being the subjected towards being the subject of subjecting the others. That is what they discuss there. Similar, one should not forget this as well, Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism is, of course, the critique that coins post-colonial thinking in relation to its counterparts, the European social sciences. And there is no critique of any theory created by the social sciences in Europe. There is the notion of Eurocentrism, and Eurocentrism is saying that the problem about the European societies is that they are dominating thinking about the world, and rather than rejecting them by showing that these theories are ideological theories, are theories which are somehow justifying the subjugation of people under the rule of capitalism, what they argue about is that we should have theories which are also powerful and try to or manage to compete with our views representing the global South in this competition of battles which are replacing the economic battles with the battles among thinkers about the question which theories are ruling the world. So that is about just some examples about how they are thinking. So that about thinking about when they reflect about the world. So I will now come to this to a few examples illustrating this debate, by those people who are very well known under this school of thought called postcolonialism. Let me just give a few examples. I want to talk about Spivak, Baba, Mosavi, and Chakrabarti, and Sanjay Seth briefly. Just to give a few examples, I just want to show how these theories are somehow dealing with this problem I tried to sketch before, called how to create an identity without referring to the material living conditions of people. The first example I want to discuss is Spivak, and this lady is famous for its concept of what she calls the strategic cultural essentialism. As I tried to say before, and you can see it here along all these examples, it is all about culture and what culture is and where it originates from and why it originates from anthropological thinking. I tried to describe a little bit before. Again, I have to say, I'm trying to sketch the overall framework of a whole school of thought, and that's quite ambitious, and therefore I can only do this in a kind of more fundamental way. The very detailed discussion of all these authors, which would be very good to do it, and I hope somebody takes this as an invitation to go through these authors more individually and more thoroughly. I just want to give some general examples to illustrate what this school of thought is about. Spivak, strategic cultural essentialism. Culture, I explained. So what is she saying? What does it mean, this strategic cultural essentialism? It is Spivak who, with this notion of strategic cultural essentialism, proposes the creation of culture as a way to create an identity of people in this world of the former colonized societies beyond any material living conditions. And what she is saying, what she wants to say when she calls this strategic cultural essentialism is this: all the people, of course including the anthropologists who created this notion of culture, they know very well that the concept of culture is a concept that provides an identification of people with whatever kind of community you call a culture, constituted by a culture. They know very well that this concept of culture creates a community, but it creates also a demarcation of other communities, and only via this demarcation it calls the identity with the community. It discredits the others. They are very much aware about it, but it does its service. We are belonging to these shared values. That is the definition of a culture in cultural theory. And this we excludes all the others all the other communities, and not only excludes them, but that this demarcation chases these communities into a battle against each other is also very well known by all cultural theorists. So what they do is, and what their theories are about, is how to domesticate the devil we created. How to domesticate the devil we created, the devil we imposed or introduced into the world to create identities. How to domesticate this devil?
Domesticate.
Sorry, ich kann im Moment nicht. Ich habe ein Video, mach gerade. Sorry, ich melde mich später. Tschüss. Sorry.
Domesticate your devil cell phone. No, I will cut this out. Don't worry. Just go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't turn it off. Normally, nobody calls me at this time. It was actually a guy from Japan. Okay, cut it away. So they are very much aware about the devil they created, the devil in the sense that it creates a discreditation of all other communities, because if the nature of a culture consists of the definition of what real humanities is about, then of course it is quite a challenge to say this is what humanity is about, but since there are other communities who do these definitions, and if they don't do these definitions in a different way, it doesn't constitute, of course, that community. So it has to be a different definition. But then if there is another community that defines this humanity, it inevitably excludes the other one. It says, how can you define humanities like this? We define humanities like this, and this is how humanity really is. So it leads the communities into conflicts. But it creates this identity beyond the material living conditions of people. So the whole debate among all these post-colonial thinkers, ruled by this concept of culture they take from anthropology in order to create their identities beyond the material living conditions, all these authors basically discuss how to domesticate the devil we created. The notion of strategic cultural essentialism wants to say this. Essentialism is the notion in all these reflections about culture, which says essentialism is a negative, is a bad thing. Essentialism is a bad thing in two respects. It's a bit absurd, but that's the absurdity this theory implies. It is what exactly constitutes the identification via culture, this essentialism. But the concept of an essential culture is bad because of these effects it has. So that's why they say culture must have some ingredients which somehow dissolve the nature of what constitutes culture. And the elements it has to have which dissolve the elements of what constitutes culture is what they characterize as, you can already guess it from the notion, essentialism. So a culture should be a culture, but it should be also open to other cultures. That's why it should not be essential. So it should not say, this is how it is, basta, and there is nothing else. That is what the meaning is behind critique of a concept of culture, which is an essential concept. So the essentialism among these people who discuss this notion of culture is essentially, cultural essentialism is bad. We shouldn't do that. But of course, they don't want to accept that there is no culture without the essentialism. But that is the contradiction of that concept. So they argue how to deal with it. And this notion of a strategic cultural essentialism by Spivak, which made her famous, is this one. She says, yeah, I know, culture has this essentialism because that is what constitutes culture. And I know that this concept of culture excludes and discredits other cultures. Of course it does. And it shouldn't do it. However, she says, and now this is the notion of strategic. What she's saying is, yeah, of course, culture is a shit. Because it has these aspects of discreditation and demarcation. But culture is strategically an element which constitutes identity. So for these strategic purposes, it is inevitable to use this concept I know very well is full of hostilities. But given the situation as it is, culture is the only way to create these identities of these people who have no other ways to create any identities. And that's why strategically it is good if one keeps in mind that it is only for the sake of this strategy to create an identity. And what she doesn't tell anybody is, when is this finished, this phase of strategic cultural identity? I have a suggestion. You don't need it anymore when you are the superpower. Then you don't need strategic cultural essentialism anymore. That much about Spivak. So again, if anybody has the, intention, the energy to discuss this whole book, please do it. If you want me to participate, write me an email. It would be good to discuss that whole book, but that is this cultural essentialism is the essential of that book, or what she always discusses. The other famous guy is Homi Bhabha. My goodness, also I must confess, yesterday I was preparing this presentation, and I want just to make a little bit a kind of joke, just to make this a bit more, all these annoying, really frustrating shit a little bit more digestible for myself, I must say. So, third space, that's Homi Bhabha. That's where he's famous for, a big professor traveling all over the world and making presentations and books and writing about this and so on and so on. So I must admit, I thought yesterday, shit, what was the third space again? So I went to my I just went on my mobile, went to to Google, not Google Maps, is it? What is it?
Google.
Anyway, I went to Google and put in Homi Bhabha's third space. And what you are reading there, it's just, I don't know. If you are a normal human being, you think, am I in a world of idiotism? Yes, you are. This guy creates this term third space. So to come back to a kind of, how do you say, a little bit more decent way of arguing and avoiding this kind of shocking experience if you read about this there. This guy, third space. The third space, if one can already guess what it means, the third space. The third space is, yes, the third space. There is culture number one, and there is culture number two. And as I said before about Spivak and her cultural essentialism, this guy had a really fantastic idea. No, isn't it great? he says, yeah, of course, culture 1 and culture 2 hate each other. They are hostile against each other, of course. So, but fuck, we are living in a world which consists of culture, because that is the world we created, no? That is our world we created in our wonderfully open mind, in which we can create any kind of nonsense we want to create. But then we create also problems as a result of the nonsense we create. The nonsense which has nothing to do with the real living conditions of anybody. This world of culture. But this is the world in which these thinkers live. And living in this world, having created this imaginary intellectual world, they say, oh, culture, yes, great, identity, done, perfect. But then we have more than one. We have two, we have several, we have many cultures. So, and this is now the image we created for ourselves about the world, how societies exist as representations of cultures. So we have a problem here we have to solve. How can they live with each other if they exclude each other? Thanks to what we created, how we define them as representing culture. Well, let's create a third room. Mamma mia, no. Jesus, know how they are thinking. Let's create a third space. A third space. We need a third space. This third space, logic doesn't matter in this way of thinking. It's really you can just create whatever your mind spits out. Sorry, if the world consists of cultures, can you please tell me the third space? Is it cultural? Is it clean from any culture? And if all this world consists of all kind of cultures, who had the intention to create that room in which the cultures can communicate with each other, which is cultural free? And if you need a cultural free room for the communication between cultures, then is there something maybe wrong with your concept of culture? A bit crazy, no? But this is the idea of the third space created by Homi Bhabha, making this guy world famous. And back to my experience yesterday night, it was Wikipedia. If I quickly wanted to remind myself, because in fact in my paper I found I had written third room, but it's really called third space. I hope so, at least that's what I found. So that's the third space. And then I found elaborations of this theory in post-colonial thinking, where people said, oh, third space, that is really a great idea. How about applying that also to the field of education? So in the field of education, we can use this concept of third space and say, okay, there are teachers on one side, there are students on the other side, and the teacher always wants to somehow impose his knowledge and the students have to digest that and so on, and that creates always the conflict. Wow, I have a good idea. I read Homi Bhabha. And how about introducing the concept of third space in the field of education? Then we have a place where they meet each other and just talk to each other, pretending all as if they are only humans and not students and teachers, and then they would get into a wonderful close relationship. Madonna. Okay, stop it here. Musavi. Andre Musavi. Andre Musavi is not dealing with culture, but he is dealing with what he calls the equality of races. And also briefly here, it is in fact post-colonial thinking, a thinking that coins itself as a way of thinking that is against the continuation of colonialism. Therefore, coins itself what we think is beyond colonialism. That's the meaning of post-colonialism. And they are always looking at the world and find everywhere where any kind of thing happens they don't like, they think doesn't suit to this world, which should consist of equality in nation states, equalities of societies, equalities of nationalisms. So, which consists of all the idealizations distinguishing all the conflicts from this world, the rationality of capitalism inserts, but from which they don't want to know anything because they have naturalized capitalism, the rationality of capitalism as the natural living conditions of humans, as the nature of civilization. The anthropologists would phrase it. Since that has been all naturalized, they consider everything that creates any kind of deviation from this ideal of a world of civilization. They consider everything as the continuation of colonialism, and that's why they coin everything what they do as somehow really going towards a society which has no colonialism anymore. So this guy is therefore also talking about, believe it or not, the equality of races. So this theory, postcolonialism, even rediscovers, reactivates a concept, the concept of race, that very concept that was introduced by the colonialists. They rediscover and reactivate this concept that was, I think, better than any other concept, theoretically representing the view of the colonialists on the colonized people. They reactivate that very concept towards a way how to create a shared identity of people, again, beyond any material living conditions. A brief word. What is race? I looked at some comments about I think it was my German presentation about this, and apparently, I think it is not really clear what the crazy thing about racism is. Racism is to interpret the articulation of a human will, what somebody wants or not wants, as the result of his nature, blood. And that's just crazy, because the human mind defines its will not as a result of his biology. That is the nature of human mind. And that is the nonsense of this concept of race. And I don't have to say more about that. I could say much more about it, how then this idiotic concept of race is somehow used, and how it's used for the purposes of subjecting the colonized people by, for example, telling them, I have to beat you up every day in order to make you go to work, because the nature of, just to give an example, how they argue, the nature of people on Philippines is they are lazy. Their nature is being lazy. So that's why they have to be forced by power to do their work. And by the way, a famous I forgot his name now, but I forgot always the names. A famous poet who is a national hero until today in the Philippines became famous because he denied that, and he said, no, Philippines are not lazy. So he somehow subscribes the concept that this racist thinking, and just says, no, our nature is not to be lazy. Our nature is to be, how do you call it? In German, it's called fleißig. I don't know what is it. We like to work hard. So that was the critique of this thinker against this racism. And this concept of racism is reactivated by post-colonial thinking today in order to use it as a means for creating communal identity, the gathering of all the people defined via their races, via the color of their skin and all these kind of things. This ridiculous concept, imposing the will of a colonizer or anybody who wants to force somebody else to do something, justified with the nature of this person who is subjected. This cynical argument is reactivated by post-colonial thinking as a means to create an identity of these people. And I don't want to say more, but this is what somehow post-colonial thinking does, and why it does this. I explained with my reference to the challenges they have, since there is no way of identifying people via the material living conditions, thanks to the rationality of the rationale of capitalism that has been imposed on these societies. The social sciences do their mission and say, well, instead of reflecting about the question, why is it not possible that people cannot identify them with these national? Is it at least desirable to identify them with these societies? No. There must be an identification, because in fact without the identification with these societies you cannot cope with that. So let's go on and find a way to find an identification of all these people. And so suddenly all the black people no longer distinguishing who is who has the political power in these countries, who is torturing the people, who is somehow forcing them to survive without being able to survive. Yes, there are also black people. No, we are all part of the same nice community of black people, and the naughty people are all the white. And with this wonderful ideology or theory, you can create an identity, including with everybody who shares this race. And with this kind of logic, you can of course always include all the political leader, the businessman, and everything who is really responsible for your living conditions in these parts of the world. And you create instead, as I showed already in my comments about the book from Leo Marie Nyodo, you create something, an African identity, via this notion of races. Leo Marie Nyodo doesn't do that, doesn't do it in that way, but another one, Andre Mozavi, is doing that via the concept of race. Next example, the application of this concept of culture, of an identity with these living conditions which are harder to accept than anywhere in the world where the where the rule of capitalism rules. Another way of doing that is somehow a way to make this way of thinking a methodological must of the creation of social thought. This is what a guy called Chakrabarty is doing. The notion he is famous for is the notion called thinking through space. That is how he phrases theorizing. So what I want to say here, there are not only theories which create the identification with the introduction of the world, of the rule of the rationality of capitalism that has been introduced in these parts of the world, opposed to the opposition which was ruling the anti-colonialist movements, it even goes a step further. In this theory, thinking through space, Chakrabarti, unlike the previous authors, not only thinks about how can I make people identify them with this world of capitalism, he even argues that thinking as such must serve the identification of theorizing with, as he calls it, the place where you are. What does that kind of complicated thing mean? It means that the creation of thought is anyway the expression of the place where you live. So what you think, people, about the world, all the thinkers and anybody who thinks about the world, cannot do anything else but articulate the position your place has. What does it mean? Of course, the place, this slightly innocent notion of a kind of location, I don't know, is it north and south and then what is it? Of course, this notion of place, this innocent concept of a geographical term, is nothing else but a political entity. So when this guy is then arguing why place is dictating, telling you what you have to think about it, the place is, of course, nothing else but a nation state. In his book, I'm referring to here, he is then giving an example and saying, look, if I talk about elections in India and if I talk about elections in Australia, it makes a substantial difference. And you can never ever say elections are elections. And you cannot even raise the questions what elections are, because people in India have a very different view on elections than people in Australia. People in Australia go to vote because they're asked to go to vote, and they do it a little bit unwillingly, but they do it. In India, people celebrate what is called election day and make a big party from that. So how can you then say election is election? So he is saying there is no objectivity. You cannot say what elections as such are. What elections are is very much dependent and must be interpreted through the view a nation state practices. So this methodological consideration advocates a kind of affirmatism that cannot be more affirmatism than this one is. Thinking can only, by the nature of thinking, this guy is saying, thanks to the nature of thinking, thinking can only reproduce the view a national society has on this. So if you could imagine any more affirmative way of celebrating thinking as representing a national view, a view a national society has or is supposed to have, then please let me know. Because of course, this is of course a construction that exists only in the imaginary world, again, of a social scientist. But in the social sciences, imaginary thinking is how thinking works. Why do I say that? Yeah, of course, there is no way how Indian people think about elections. That is the official position the Indian nation state, the Indian society, or whoever has to see the election as it is celebrated thanks to the election or based on the election day. But of course, there are also people in India who don't go for voting, and also people in India who have a different view on elections and whatever. There are people who criticize elections like everywhere, but this he excludes as not representing the Indian view he shares. And of course, this is the nasty way of presenting his thought he shares with the nation of India as the need of how thinking works. Now, just let me stop at this place. It is I try to give some examples of how postcolonial thinking works, how it serves the need to create an identity of people in a part of the world in which this identity creation cannot be done via the identification with the material living interests of people, because these the living conditions don't provide this identification, due to the fact that the way people can say life here is okay in wherever, Germany or whatever, because I get my job, I can provide my food for my family. This is not existing, despite of the fact that the only way you can get access to the things you need for life, eating, living in a place, can only be bought by money. But you cannot get the money simply by getting a salary from a job, because they don't exist. And in these countries, therefore, the challenge is if you want to create an identification, a way of identifying people with this rationale of capitalism, and if you consider this as the challenge, and postcolonial thinking is considering this as the challenge, far away from criticizing capitalism, no, capitalism has been naturalized, then you are inventing the notion of culture, in which you define the way of living, of coping with this rationality of capitalism. That is what these former anti-capitalist thinkers have become under the concept, the school of thought of post-colonial thinking. That is how they shifted their mind from anti-capitalists towards post-colonial thinkers. And this, in fact, raises a question. It raises the question, how on earth did this work? How did this shift, the shift from arguing against capitalism and now finding justifications for the identification with the rationale of capitalism imposed into these parts of the world after the transformation of the colonized world into capitalism? How could this happen? How did this work? How did they manage to shift their way of thinking from arguing against capitalism towards ways of identifying yourself with capitalism? They have naturalized as the normal part of, the representation of civilized societies. How does this happen? And this is then what I will talk about next in the next meeting, the next session. And that's why we can stop here for now. Please, if you have any comments, feel invited. Again, I have to say that I try to do nothing less but sketch the major challenges and the major responses to these challenges, the way they're the challenges to thinking with the transformation of this colonized world, the worlds oppressed by capitalism, towards capitalism. And what do the thinkers do who were also shifting from their minds from what? From being anti-capitalists towards becoming post-colonial thinkers? What is the what is it, what they did with the way they are creating their thought under the concept coined postcolonialism. That's what I try to sketch. That's all for today. Okay.
Great, Michael. Thanks for this lecture, and we will be looking forward to having you on for the following topic, historical materialism, and some of the consequences that follow out of this. So everybody stay tuned, and as always, please write us 99zu1@gmail.com. You find the email address also in the description of this channel. Write us if you want to debate these topics with Michael. We are very eager to set up a debate like this, even though we don't find many other people that are eager. So it's difficult to find someone to actually debate these topics, which is kind of weird, as this discourse is obviously very spread throughout the world. So there should be some people maybe wanting to defend what Michael is critiquing here. So please let us know so that we can invite you in. Yeah, Michael.
Well, the irony is, if I may add this, it is part, but I will talk about that in the next or second next session. Protecting this way of thinking against any critique of this way of thinking is part of the nature of postcolonial thinking. But that's what is my conclusion about. And that's why it is not so surprising that these people don't say, well, you know, what you're saying there about us is really not nice. Let's talk about it. No, they say we don't talk about anybody, about anything. And why this is the logic consequence of this way of thinking is something I want to also talk about in the second next session then. So.
Yes. So if there is somebody interested after all, let us know, as I said. And yeah, with that, thanks a lot for your time, Michael. Thanks a lot for everybody listening in.
Thanks a lot for though having the opportunity to say these things about postcolonial thinking, though nobody from the postcolonial thinkers would ever deal with any kind of critique of what they're doing. But
everybody share this video in your English-speaking spaces and with your friends. So
we'll see.
Let's see.
Yes.
Okay, bye-bye. See you soon.
Take care, bye.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Wenn euch dieses Video gefallen hat, klickt auf Like, abonniert den Kanal und vergesst nicht das Glöckchen zu drücken, damit ihr benachrichtigt werdet, wenn wir neuen Content droppen.
Außerdem solltet ihr uns überall folgen, wo wir verfügbar sind. Das ist Facebook, Instagram, Twitter und Twitch. Und wenn wir irgendwelche Ankündigungen machen oder Posts, dann shared, was das Zeug hält. Gebt uns all eure Liebe.
Wir haben mittlerweile ziemlich signifikante Kosten. Wenn ihr es euch irgendwie leisten könnt, unterstützt uns doch auf Patreon. Dann kommt ihr auch in den Genuss verschiedener Vorteile, wie zum Beispiel Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community oder Zugang zu den ultrageheimen Patreon-Episoden, die wir dort posten. Außerdem könnt ihr uns natürlich auch über PayPal Spenden zukommen lassen.
Außerdem haben wir mittlerweile einen eigenen Online-Shop. Das heißt, wenn ihr euch immer noch fragt, was ihr euren Lieben zu Weihnachten, Ostern oder sonst wie schenken könnt, geht dorthin und kauft duftes Merch.
Alle Links dazu hier in der Beschreibung oder auch auf unserer Webseite 99zu1.de.
Vielen Dank fürs Dabeisein, danke für die Unterstützung und wir sehen uns in diesem Theater.